Thank you for joining me for a walkthrough of the Dynamics GP 18.3 enhancements. My name is John Kirsch. I'm the GP product lead at Dynamic Consulting. You'll see my contact information, social media sites, and blog site on the bottom of this page. Feel free to follow those or check out the information and subscribe to get additional content in the future. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to focus on some of the system-wide enhancements for this release. And the first one we're going to take a look at here is the schedule check links function. So we've had the report scheduler that's been a part of Dynamics GP for quite some time, but now the enhancement is that the check links function has been made available through that report scheduler. So we're able to go ahead and run that and schedule that process so that we can run it. All the same rules apply that have applied for running check links. So we do need to have the appropriate rights. We do need to be able to have everybody out of the system. So everything like normal needs to happen, but we can have that scheduled and run unattended. GP does have to be logged in for that report schedule to kick off. And we'll go through some of the setup here of the steps to make that work. Within GP, we want to navigate to administration, and then the setup here is under routines. So the first window we want to go into is the report setup. And within this location, the key here is that we want to have a default location for our reports. If you have a SharePoint site or a network share that you can save those to, that's what we're looking for. This is the place that the reports are going to generate to, and we can go ahead and review those after checklinks is done, and we can see the results of running that process. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out, and I'm going to open up my report schedule. This is the spot that we have all of our reports, but we will now see some of our checklinks options. So scroll down a little bit here, and I have my general ledger set up. I'll also mark my account transaction history. So that would take me a little while for that to run, but I'm just going to schedule it for right now so that it'll run at midnight is the key for this. So you would pick the date or the frequency that this would run for, but again, there's no specific time that we can run it. It kicks off at midnight. So you'll see here I have actually today's date selected, but if I hit calculate the next day, it's going to go ahead and move to our next calendar day because it's basically going to run at midnight based on the schedule here. So I've now set this up. I've got a couple of options and I can hit apply. I'm going to go ahead and close this window. The place where I would go if I want to review or make changes to the scheduled processes is under the report publishers. As I open that up, I can enter my user ID with the SA account that I'm using, and you'll see those two that I just added here. So you can see that they are marked and scheduled to be run. I can actually click into here and see the details, and I can also make some changes in here. Ultimately, I could delete them as well if I wanted to stop those from running. But otherwise, I would leave these set up as is and make sure GP is logged in, and the process will kick off at midnight tonight. The next system-wide feature I'm going to talk about is multi-factor authentication. This allows us to be able to set up that MFA or two-factor authentication with our email services. I will point out at this point, if you get a copy of the slides, all of these titles that you see underlined are hyperlinked to go back to the documentation on docs.microsoft.com. So you'll be able to see all the full detail of how to set up these things or drill into the additional information that's provided there. This one can get a little bit technical in the setup. We do need to go ahead and create that application and inside of Azure. So we need somebody with the right rights to be able to do that. And then once we get that all set up and running with the app ID, then we can come back and go ahead and paste that key into the ID here. So there is some setup in this one. Again, we need the right security. So somebody that's administering the email environment is probably pretty familiar with being able to set these things up and can help out a lot in this feature. But the key is here, as we've moved with higher security and that recommended two-factor authentication for email. We now have that ability in GP to take advantage of that feature and provide that extra level of security within the system. This next enhancement is a technical update as well. The support for TLS 1.2 is included with GP 18.3. What that means is there is a security enhancement now to now use this newer version of TLS. So 1.0 and 1.1 are not needed anymore, especially when we're talking about emailing features or like web services or the web client. So this is an important security enhancement to be compatible with some of the requirements of certain things such as VAT tax. You'll see down on the bottom, there are a couple of features that still do use the TLS 1.0. These are inside the domain type functions, like the web services if we're using SQL Server authentication or the Excel refreshable report. There is a workaround, especially with the Excel refreshable report, but a little less security worry about those items being inside the domain versus some of the other ones that could potentially be external. So a little less risk in that area, but note that if you are using those features that we may still need TLS 1.0 turned on for those features to function. The next feature has to do with your home page for GP as well as the series pages. The enhancement is that the home screen will now save the per user column layouts, and it will also apply those as we navigate through the different series. So you're able to keep that consistent look and feel or navigation options throughout the system per user. In GP, I'll go ahead and take a look at my layout. So I'll click on Customize this page. And within this layout, you'll see first off the pages that I have turned on here. I have the 2-column layout, and I like that column stack on the bottom. So I'm going to say OK to that. And what that means is that I'll go ahead and make my to-do pane a little bit bigger here. And you can see my columns get stacked on the bottom down here. And what this means is that as I navigate to the different series, I'll go into Financial, and I also have that layout where my columns are now stacked on the bottom. And you can see it carries through to the other pages. So you get that consistent carry through per user so that you can keep that easy navigation for your preference. The next system enhancement helps disable the additional print dialog box when using a Word template. This is accomplished by using the named printer setup. Now when we use the named printers, we have the checkbox in the setup named printers box that I have on the screen here. We have the option to mark this to be used with Word templates. So that allows us the extra Word template box that pops up where we have to actually pick to print an additional time, and can save time by using the named printer functionality to direct that report right to a specific printer. To enable this option, I've navigated into the administration window and under setup and name printers. So I've already gone through the initial setup here with name printers. If you haven't, you will have to set a machine ID and go through some pretty simple setup for name printers. You can see my default system printer here is set. I'm going to go ahead and click on this printer ID to launch into the setup name printers window. And here is where that checkbox is. So now I can mark to say I'm going to use that name printer when printing Word templates, and it will again not have that additional print dialog box when I'm printing those templates. The next enhancement pertains to self-service users and the web client. The new enhancement allows self-service users to get to the user preferences window. So because of some of the security restrictions in the past versions of GP, that window was not available. And that window is particularly important to be able to get to the workflow delegation options. So if those self-service users were approvers, we weren't able to easily get to that window and be able to do that delegation. So this enhancement kind of cleans up that issue and allows those users to be able to get into the user preferences ultimately able to perform that workflow delegation as needed. And the next enhancement is within SMARTLIST. This enhancement allows the ability to bulk edit SMARTLIST columns. What that means is that I can remove multiple columns at one time, or I can move those in location, so moving them up or down or to the beginning or the end of the SMARTLIST columns. Within GP, we'll go ahead and open our SMARTLIST. I'm going to use my financial and account transactions here, and I'm going to go ahead and run the default option. As this finishes running, I'm going to click on columns, and I have my displayed columns here. I'm going to go ahead and add. I'll just pick 2 of these to add to the report option here, and you can see as normal that adds it to the bottom of the report. The change here is that I have these columns here on the left hand side to select one or more columns, and as I select those as normal, my options here are available to move these locations around. So if I want to make both of those the first 2 columns, I can go ahead and click that, and instead of having to do one at a time to make those moves, I can go ahead and make that change. And if I want to also remove any of these, I'll pick a couple of other different columns here, and I can go ahead and mark those and remove those in bulk as well. So it allows me to make these changes without having to do those one column at a time like we did in the past. And the last feature that we have in the system-wide enhancements is the maximum print output screen. And these titles here are hyperlinked, and if you go check out the documentation or the information from Microsoft on the site, this one has a message saying this may have been the largest requested feature of all time. This was a pretty big one, and if you've used reports printed to the screen, I'm sure you know this one immediately, is that we've typically in the past had to change our percentage for viewing or maximize the screen to be able to have everything fit on the screen. Almost every report that came up didn't really show us everything. So what this will do now is after it gets done running, it will always maximize the report, saving us at least a couple of clicks and kind of the frustration that goes with having to change the screen size all the time. We'll be able to see everything on the screen right in front of us every time. For this feature, we can again see this on any report. I have a customer maintenance card open here. I'm just going to print that customer report. It's going to prompt me where I want to print that to. So we want to check out this enhancement by printing it to the screen. And again, you'll want to watch quickly. This one goes pretty fast, but it'll generate. And then at the end, you'll see it maximize that report. There it is, showing full screen. If it wasn't full screen, you'll remember it looked something like this again, where it's cutting off. So you'll quickly get used to having this feature happen automatically so that we can see the full report every single time, and be very happy that we don't have to click or move that around or change the percentages going forward. Now we're going to move on and check out some of the enhancements in the financial series. And the first enhancement in this area we're going to take a look at has to do with the GL transaction entry window. And we now have 2 new user-defined fields that we can use with general ledger transactions. We can configure those in the setup, and those fields then can be used for reporting or added to SMARTLIST in the future to filter or sort on GL entries. First, we'll take a look at the setup for this, and we're under Financials, Setup, and General Ledger. And within this window down on the bottom, we'll now see our 2 user-defined labels. So we can go ahead and change those as we would like to define the usage of each one of those fields. Once we have those set up, we'll go ahead and take a look in the transaction entry window. So under Transactions General, and if I go ahead and create a new transaction, you'll see now I have my 2 user-defined fields here that I can go ahead and enter. Again, these are optional fields. You can use them or not, but they will be there by default after you upgrade to this latest release. And you do not have to label them or anything for them to be enabled. They'll be using this user-defined 1 and user-defined 2 default labels, and they'll be available for users to start entering those. Again, those fields will be available and visible inside of SmartLists and other reports, and you'll also start to see those show up then in your journal entry inquiry window as well. So you'll be able to see those on screen as you start using that field. The next enhancement is in the payables area, and this feature allows us to import credit card transactions into GP. There's a couple of setup options that we'll go over inside of GP, where we map the vendor and the transaction type for the GL account. And then we also have to download our files then from the website or from the credit card vendor. The types are listed here. QBO, QFO, or QFX file formats are supported, and really no setup to define as long as we're using one of the accepted file format types. In GP, we'll take a look at the setup items first. We're in purchasing and setup now, and we're going to go into the payables setup. Inside of here, we have those 2 buttons that were highlighted on the slide. So first we'll go ahead and open up the vendor map. And what that allows us to do is type in the credit card, the organization here, and pick a vendor ID. So basically we're mapping who we're getting the credit card file from and which vendor ID that is going to link to inside the Dynamics GP system. So this will actually be a field inside of the file. And then next, we are going to map the transaction type. One of the fields will be transaction type that we can label or map from the file, and then we can pick a GL account. We can have everything default to just the GL account for that vendor ID, like we do with a normal payables transaction, or we can map multiple transaction types. We have some for advertising expense, some for general office expense, and we have a GL account that correlates to each one of those examples, then we can map that here in the system, so then those GL entries come in correctly for the expenses. Once those setups are complete, we'll be already ready to be able to use this feature. We'll then be able to come into the Import Payables Invoices under Transactions, find that file that we downloaded, browse to it, select it, and go ahead and process that import. So those will go into their own batch and be available to review and post, just like most other import features or tools with GP work. So it doesn't automatically post anything. It allows you to go in and do that final review, make sure everything looks right before you go ahead and post the batch. The next enhancement in the financial area is the ability to reconcile all financial years. We've had the ability to do this one at a time in the past, and you can see the screens on the right-hand side. This is used occasionally when we make some changes to the system, like if we reverse a closed year or something similar to that. We typically reconcile the years, and we start at the oldest year and go forward from there. Oftentimes, maybe only the oldest closed year and then all the open years after that might be the functionality. If we've ever run that or needed to run that for all years, and rather than needing to do that separately or the steps to go click through each one of the years, we now have that option to do all. It really does the same process as it did before. It'll run on the oldest year and it'll complete that year, then it'll move on to the next year, etc., till it completes all of the years in the system. It will also pop up that message on the bottom of the right-hand side of the screen, and that is a warning just telling you that if there are any transactions that were removed, or if we're using like an archiving tool, that will cause some issues in the system, because what this is doing is retotaling those balances. So if we're removing history, then the reconcile is not something that we want to run on any one of the series, especially financial, but we have taken out some of that detailed information, so we don't want to run the reconcile or we cause some issues. We want to read that every time, think about it, make sure that it is safe to run that function, and if it is, we can go ahead and proceed with that. This next enhancement has to do with the GL copy-paste feature within the financial series. And what the difference is that that feature will now look at the separators value in the currency setup. You'll see that window over on the left-hand side here, and I highlighted the columns or fields that it's now going to use to be part of that Excel copy-paste feature. In the past, it didn't use this or look at what those decimal places were. It would use whatever Excel was specifying in the file. What it'll do now is make sure that it matches the number of decimal places when it pastes data into GP. And this was an issue, a really tricky one, because it created some odd rounding issues that only showed up sometimes on financial reports or some other reports, so really tricky to find, and also a bit complicated to fix if we had to ever deal with that. So now, again, this kind of cleans that up. We don't have to make any changes in the system to take advantage of this, because the Excel copy-paste feature will now just automatically start using these fields and make sure we're using the same decimal places and reading that separator properly going forward for this feature. This next feature is in the payables area, and similar to the GL Excel copy-paste feature, we now have this available in the accounts payable transaction entry window. We can now paste a number of the fields, and also we are able to paste the distribution information into a new payables transaction entry document. There is no setup required, but we do have to follow the template. I have a picture of the template columns in the lower left-hand corner, and these are the fields that we can paste or utilize through this copy-paste feature. So it'll paste the description, the purchases amount, trade discount amount, freight and miscellaneous amounts as well, and the document number, PO number, and the cash amount if included. And then down on the bottom last, you can see the distribution. So we can use one or the other, and I'll show you how that works here within GP. Our first step is to open the payables transaction entry window. So under purchasing transactions, transaction entry, and you can see I have a new document open in my screen here. We can fill out this top information, in particular a document type, if we are going to save this to a batch, which I'm going to use my test batch. And we also need to select our vendor ID. I'm going to pick my ACE Travel vendor and just tab off of that. At this point, I can now copy and paste my transaction. So I have my template over here, and I'm going to select those fields and copy. And now you can see my paste button is available, and I'm going to go ahead and click paste. Again, it pastes in the description, those dollar amounts that I had, and you'll see the document number and PO number here as well. As soon as I hit paste, just like any payables transaction, it will create the default distributions. So I'm going to go ahead and click into this window, and you can see it created some distributions. But if I have some changes that I want to make, you can see here that the account is 6520. I really wanted 6530. I maybe have a number of other changes that could be in the distributions. How I want to do that is first delete the distributions that it auto-generated. You can see that clears my screen, and that also makes my paste button available up on the top. I'm going to go ahead and select my values here and all the cells, and I'll hit paste. And as simple as that, it's now included all of that information into the window. I can OK. It'll do my normal checks at that point. It'll check to make sure it's balanced and give me any messages if anything isn't right with the distribution that it sees. It didn't give me any warnings. I can save this, and again, If there are any messages, it'll go through the normal process at this point. This one's giving the message that this vendor also has some existing purchase orders, which is another feature that I have turned on. I'm okay with that, so I'm going to go ahead and continue, and it saved my transaction for me. The next couple of enhancements have to do with the 1099 form changes within Dynamics GP. If you're printing 1099s from GP, you're probably already familiar with this change now. In 2020, or the tax year of 2020, the NEC form was introduced. That was added into GP at year end and was also required a number of changes to the miscellaneous form to account for that. Existing vendors that were set up in the system as 1099 vendors were all moved to this NEC type, and anything that needed to be changed as far as the vendor types could go ahead and use the utilities to go back in there and make changes to move those properly. The vendor card did reflect those options, as well as the update 1099 information utilities in the system to be able to see that new option type. And again, we now have that drop down in the print 1099 forms where we can select the NEC type document. The next slide also covers the miscellaneous updates, which again correlate to the NEC form being introduced and some of the box changes that happened on the form. One additional change in the payables area is the DBA field, or the doing business as. So many businesses have that DBA title as well as the normal company name, and this DBA is located now under the vendor maintenance card under the options button, and you can go ahead and fill that in. And this was also added to the 1099 forms. So keep in mind, if you've had any modifications to that form, if it's already a modified report, then you would have to make sure to go in there and add that field, because GP is not going to automatically go in and make a change to a modified report. So you might have to go in and make those changes yourself if you're not seeing that field available on your report. To show you where that field is again, I'm under Purchasing, Cards, and Vendor. I'll go ahead and select my first vendor, and we have the Options button right on the bottom. When we click on that, you'll see this new DBA field here, and we'll just fill that in as DBA, and we can go ahead and save that. So that field is available again on the 1099 forms, but you can use that on other reports as well. So you can use that report or that field as you see fit. And the last update in the financials area of GP for this version is the ability for the Payables Management Historical Age Trial Balance to remove the fully applied multi-currency documents. What that means is that now GP will not see a remaining amount on the documents and try to keep those on the report if we're excluding fully applied documents. And that's typically caused by a revaluation of the invoice before it was paid. So when GP is looking at the revaluation and the dollar amounts, it viewed it as not being fully paid and applied, so it would not drop it off of that report. A lot of times we had to go in and make some SQL modifications to a field to be able to have that report read it and view it as being fully applied. But again, now with the change that's been made, that automatically happens, and from my point of view, reads it as if you would expect it to, that it's taking into account the revaluation that happened and that it can see that it's a fully applied document. Again, this is one of those that doesn't need any additional changes or checkbox options or anything like that. It's a calculation that's made in the code and should reflect those documents properly as you expect. Next, we have one enhancement in the distribution series that we're going to cover, and that has to do with the ability to import and export stock counts in Excel. This allows us to take that information as we set up a stock count export it into a template that we can use to do all of the entry in Excel, and then import it back into the system. This is a very much needed feature from my point of view. If you use stock count and you've gone through the entry through the window, you probably would agree or have experienced that firsthand. But this allows us, again, taking advantage of Excel and the power and ease of use in that area to be able to do that entry. We'll take a quick look at that feature inside of GP. Inside of inventory, we'll go ahead and open up our stock count schedule under transactions. And I'm going to open the small stock count that I have set up to use as an example here. So you can see here, this is a not started stock count. I'm going to go ahead and start that. I'm going to cancel my reports for now. And once I have a started stock count, I now have the export import button available for me in the schedule as well as the stock count entry windows here. What I see as the most typical process is we probably want to go ahead and start that and then export our Excel template right away. It would allow me to go ahead and pick where I'm going to save that stock count to. I'm going to just save it to my temp drive. It'll tell me the file has been exported. I would then go out and find that file and open it up. And within this file, you'll see the couple of items that we have set up inside of our stock count. So we have our two items here, which site they're for. These were only in the warehouse location that we're counting. And then we have our field here. So I can go ahead and enter my counts for each one of these. I will go ahead and take a look. We'll say 110. I can save my file and close it. So normal usage of Excel to go ahead and create those entries. Next, I'll open up my stock count entry window, and I'll go ahead and open up this demo option that I have set up, and I have that export import button up on the top. You'll see my export option is grayed out. It won't allow me to do an export multiple times. I can only export that file one time. I'll go ahead and pick my import option here, and I'll browse out to the folder where I saved that file and select the file where I saved those counts. As soon as I do that, it'll start the import process. For this one, it's very small, so it goes very, very fast, and you can see it's already completed. And here we have it, 10 and 100, each one of the values that I went ahead and counted. And you can see it updated my variance quantity automatically and marked them as verified. Once the import is completed, it follows the same process that you're used to for your stock count entry. So everything else is the same after this point. You have to go ahead and manually finish this and complete all the rest of your processes. We have one HR and payroll enhancement for 18.3 that we want to take a look at. And that is the ability to mask Social Security numbers on human resource reports. We've had an enhancement in the past that started to mask those on the payroll reports, and that was a very good security enhancement, but it didn't go into this list of human resources reports. So now we do have that option available, and this is under our human resource preferences window, and we can go ahead and mark or unmark those as needed. By default, all the report options should be marked after you upgrade, so it'll start to mask those. So if you want to unmask those reports, you would go into the window and uncheck the box. To navigate to review and change those options, I'm going under Administration, under Setup, and we have our Human Resource Preferences. And over on the right-hand side here, we have our Social Security number mask button, and you can see here, all of mine are unchecked. So I'm going to go ahead and mark all of those to make sure that we're masking those Social Security numbers. Again, those will now show up as X's like we see on the screen here, so that we're not displaying the Social Security number information on reports. It is a good idea to go double check that if you want to add that enhancement to your reports. Again, see a simple navigation here just to verify that those do get marked and we're protecting that private information for everybody. That wraps up the enhancements for Dynamics GP 18.3. I want to thank you for spending the time to go through these enhancements. I hope everybody found some new features that will help you out in your daily processes. Again, my name is John Kirsch. My information is down on the bottom. Please follow or subscribe to those sites for additional information. And thank you and have a great day.